Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to another deep dive with us.
Yes.
We're going to be looking at a time that's, I think, often overshadowed by, disco balls and bell bottoms in the 1970s.
Yeah.
But behind the scenes, there was this incredible surge of Indigenous activism happening in both the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's something that we don't always hear a lot about. So I'm excited to kind of dig into this a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're talking treaty violations.
Right.
We're talking land rights.
Right.
A fight for self-determination.
Determination, yeah.
This was a defining era for Indigenous communities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's important, I think, to realize that this wasn't just like a continuation of the 60s and the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
This was its own distinct wave, fueled by Indigenous peoples demanding the recognition of their inherent sovereignty and treaty rights.
Yeah.
They wanted more than just inclusion within existing systems. They wanted control over their own destinies.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at two of the major players in this movement.
Okay.
The American Indian Movement, or A, in the U.S., and the National Indian Brotherhood, or NIB, in Canada.
Okay.
And one of the things that's really interesting is that both of these groups use occupation as this really powerful protest tactic.
Right.
So think about, Alcatraz Island. Think about the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Yeah.
These actions really grabbed the world's attention.
For sure.
Yeah, and these occupations were about more than just taking over physical spaces, right?
Yeah.
They were about reclaiming a narrative.
Right.
They were about showing the world that Indigenous people had a voice and deserved to be heard.
Absolutely.
It was a challenge to the status quo, forcing governments to confront the injustices of the past and present.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it.
So let's start with AIM in the U.S.
Okay.
They formed in 1968. Initially, they were focusing on these urban issues like police brutality.
Yeah.
But pretty quickly, they realized that the roots of these problems ran much deeper,
Right.
to broken treaties, government neglect,
Yeah.
and a system that was designed to erase their cultures.
Yeah, and here's where you really see the influence of the African-American civil rights movement.
Oh, interesting.
AM drew inspiration from those tactics, direct action,
Yeah.
public demonstrations, occupying symbolic spaces to force the government to listen. It was about making their presence impossible to ignore.
Okay, so tell me about this Alcatraz Island occupation.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is one that, I remember learning about it and
Yeah.
just being like, wow, this is a big deal.
Yeah, so this was in 1969. A group of activists representing tribes from all over took over this abandoned prison island in San Francisco Bay.
Yeah.
And they held it
For how long?
for over a year and a half.
Wow.
And their proclamation at the time was incredible. They declared Alcatraz more than suitable for an Indian reservation, as determined by the white man's own standards.
Oh, that's so powerful.
Right. It was this brilliant way to expose the hypocrisy of the government's treatment of Indigenous people, turning their own logic against them.
Yeah, and that's such a powerful statement because it really flips the script on how reservations were viewed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was a way of saying, you say these isolated, neglected places with limited resources are good enough for us.
Yeah.
Well, here's Alcatraz.
Right.
It fits your description perfectly.
Oh, I love that.
Right.
And even though they were eventually removed, Alcatraz became this really enduring symbol of resistance.
Right.
It showed the world that Indigenous people were not going to stay silent any longer.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's a key takeaway here, right? It wasn't just about taking over this piece of land.
Yeah.
It was about reclaiming a narrative, showing that Indigenous people had a voice and deserved to be heard.
Absolutely.
So Ammon didn't stop there.
Right. They didn't.
In 1972, they organized the Trail of Broken Treaties, this cross-country march to Washington, D.C., culminating in the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Yeah.
The very agency that's supposed to be advocating for them.
Right, exactly.
So during that occupation, Ammon presented their 20-point position paper outlining their demands.
Right.
And you know what's so fascinating about this document to me is it wasn't just a list of grievances.
Right.
It was like a blueprint for self-determination.
Yeah.
They demanded land restoration, improved health care and respect for tribal sovereignty.
Absolutely.
Essentially asserting their right to govern themselves.
Yeah.
It's incredible to think about the courage that it took to stand up to the government like that.
Yeah, for sure.
And, it did force the government to acknowledge there was a problem.
Right.
It put Indigenous issues on the national agenda. Even though all of their demands weren't met immediately, it was a turning point. In terms of visibility and forcing that dialogue.
For sure, for sure.
And then, of course, there's the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973.
Right.
And this location wasn't chosen randomly. It was the site of the 1890 massacre.
Yeah.
This deliberate act of reclaiming a painful history.
Absolutely.
So what sparked this particular occupation?
Well, so this one was sparked by a really tragic event.
Okay.
The murder of Wesley Badhart Bull and the subsequent arrest of his mother, Sarah Badhart Bull.
Wow.
And this really ignited the anger and frustration that had been simmering for generations.
Wow, that's heartbreaking.
It is.
And it really speaks to these deep-seated injustices that fueled this whole era of activism.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about this occupation. How long did it last?
Yeah, so the occupation lasted 71 days.
Wow.
It was this tense standoff between activists and federal authorities. And tragically, 2 Native lives were lost during the siege.
Wow.
While it didn't achieve all of its goals,
it
undeniably shifted the conversation around Indigenous rights, forcing the nation to confront these unresolved issues at the heart of the conflict.
And this kind of brings up a question that I think a lot of people, wrestle with, and maybe our listeners are wrestling with it too. Was AIM's more militant approach justified?
Right.
Given the decades of broken promises and systematic oppression, can we blame them for resorting to these tactics?
Yeah, it's a complex question, and there's really no easy answer.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to understand the historical context. AIM emerged from a place of deep frustration and a sense of urgency. They felt like they had exhausted all other options.
So while AIM was making waves in the U.S., Indigenous activism was also taking on a slightly different flavor in Canada.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's shift our focus there now and explore how the movement unfolded north of the border.
Yeah, let's do it.
So what were some of the key issues that were driving the movement in Canada?
So in Canada, the struggle was often centered on environmental justice and combating systemic racism within the legal system. It was about protecting their lands and resources, as well as fighting for equal treatment under the law.
Got it.
So a bit of a different focus, but still very much connected to this larger fight for Indigenous rights.
Yeah.
So one of the key issues in Canada was the devastating impact of industrial expansion on Indigenous lands. Talking about pollution, resource depletion, and serious health risks for communities.
Yeah, and this is something that I think a lot of people don't realize, right, is that industrial expansion often came at the expense of Indigenous communities who were already marginalized and didn't have the same kind of power to push back against these things.
Yeah, for sure.
So do you have an example that really kind of captures the gravity of what was happening?
Yeah, the case of Dryden Chemicals in Ontario is a really shocking example. Their mercury dumping into the English Wabigoon River system poisoned the water sources of nearby Grassy Narrows and Awabis Moon First Nations communities. And this caused severe neurological problems, birth defects, and long-term health consequences for generations.
It's horrifying to think about that these communities were essentially sacrificed for the sake of industrial profit. Their traditional way of life, which depended on the land and water, was disrupted. Their health was jeopardized for years to come.
It was a major environmental and social injustice.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. This crisis, as devastating as it was, did lead to some positive change.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me.
Yeah.
So how did activism lead to real change in this case?
So the outrage over the mercury poisoning at Grassy Narrows brought Indigenous health issues to the forefront. And it spurred the development of the Indian Health Transfer Policy, which gave First Nations communities more control over their own health care.
So even amidst these tragedies, there were glimmers of progress and empowerment.
Exactly.
And this theme of reclaiming control extended to the education system as well.
Right.
Remember the residential school system we talked about? It had been so damaging to indigenous cultures and communities.
For generations.
For generations.
Yeah.
But in the 1970s, it finally started to be dismantled.
Finally, what a relief.
Right. It was a long overdue change. By 1973, many indigenous children were attending schools run by their own band councils, especially at the elementary level. And this was a huge step towards cultural preservation.
Oh, wow.
Allowing these children to learn their own languages and traditions, something that had been denied to generations before them. Yeah, and to finally have control over their children's education must have been a major victory for indigenous communities.
But it's important to acknowledge that there was and still is a long way to go.
Yeah.
Access to high school remained limited, particularly in remote areas. And even today, the legacy of the residential school system continues to cast a shadow.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear. Right? There are often setbacks and ongoing challenges, even as positive changes are happening.
For sure.
So speaking of challenges, the story of Helen Betty Osborne is this chilling example of the systemic racism that permeated Canadian society at the time. So in 1971, this young Cree student was brutally murdered by 4 white youth in the past Manitoba.
It's a horrific story.
It sends chills down my spine. Just the fact that it took 14 years for anyone to be arrested is appalling.
It is.
What does that tell you?
It speaks volumes about the deeply ingrained racial bias within the justice system. The inquiry that followed concluded that racism had absolutely played a role in the delayed justice.
And this case must have been a major turning point in terms of acknowledging the vulnerability of indigenous women and girls.
It was.
Yeah.
The murder of Helen Betty Osborne became a rallying cry for legal reforms and greater protection for indigenous women and girls.
Yeah.
It forced Canadians to confront the reality of racism within their own institutions.
And it's a tragedy that sadly echoes through the decades as the issue of missing and murdered indigenous women continues to plague Canada.
It really underscores the fact that these struggles for justice and equality are ongoing. The 1970s were a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
But the work is far from finished.
So we've talked about the actions and the events of the 1970s.
Right.
But I'm curious about how historians view this period of indigenous activism.
Yeah.
How do they make sense of all this?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
There are actually several different schools of thought on this.
Okay.
You have the Indigenous school, which centers the perspectives and voices of Indigenous peoples themselves. They emphasize self-determination and reclaiming sovereignty as the driving forces behind the movement.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Putting Indigenous voices at the center of their own history seems pretty crucial.
So what are some of the other perspectives?
Okay, so we've got the Indigenous school. What else is there?
You have the Revisionist school, which really digs into the tactics used by activists.
Yeah.
Particularly groups like AIM.
Okay.
They focus on justifying those confrontational tactics.
Yeah.
You know, the occupations, the protests, as a necessary response to decades of injustice and government inaction.
So they're kind of trying to reframe how we view those more militant actions, arguing they were justified given the historical context.
Exactly. Then there's the Progressive School, which looks at the broader socioeconomic and environmental injustices that fueled the movement. They see the fight for Indigenous rights as part of a larger struggle for social justice and equality.
So they're kind of connecting it to those wider movements happening at the time,
Right.
Civil rights, environmentalism, and so on.
Exactly.
Okay.
And finally, you have the Consensus School.
Okay.
This perspective highlights the growing awareness of inequality and the need for change across North America in the 1970s. They see Indigenous activism as part of a larger societal shift towards recognizing and addressing injustices.
So 4 different schools of thought, each offering a unique lens through which to understand the complexities of this era.
Right.
It's amazing how history can be interpreted in so many ways.
It is.
And it's important, I think, to consider these different perspectives because they shape how we understand the past.
For sure. And how we approach the present.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about what happened back then.
Right.
It's about how those events continue to influence us today.
For sure. It's fascinating to see how the events of the 1970s continue to reverberate today.
Yeah, it's like those ripples in a pond, you know, spreading outward and creating lasting change.
Yeah.
But we've focused a lot on the political and legal side of things. What about the cultural impact?
Oh, that's a crucial point.
Yeah.
The 1970s weren't just about legal battles and political victories. It was also a time of incredible cultural resurgence for indigenous communities.
Okay.
Think about the impact of events like the Alcatraz Occupation.
Okay. Remind me what was so significant about Alcatraz in this context.
It wasn't just a political protest. It was a gathering of indigenous people from all over the country, sharing their cultures and traditions, reclaiming their heritage in a very public way.
Yeah.
It sparked a sense of pride and identity.
That had been suppressed for generations.
It's like a reawakening, a reclaiming of what had been lost.
Absolutely.
I can see how that would have ripple effects far beyond
Right.
the occupation itself.
Exactly.
So how else did this cultural revival manifest?
Oh, in so many ways. There was a revival of traditional languages, a resurgence of art and music, and a renewed focus on spiritual practices.
Okay.
All of this helped to strengthen indigenous communities and reconnect them to their roots.
It's so powerful to think about how art and culture can be such powerful tools for healing and empowerment.
For sure.
Like reclaiming your voice and your story.
Absolutely.
And this cultural revitalization wasn't limited to the U.S., was it?
No, not at all.
So what was happening in Canada?
So in Canada, the phasing out of residential schools allowed indigenous communities to begin reclaiming their languages and traditions as well.
Okay.
It was a slow and painful process, but so vital to their healing.
It's a reminder that these movements were about so much more than just legal rights.
Right.
They were about the survival and flourishing of entire cultures.
For sure.
And this cultural revival is still ongoing today, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You see it in the work of contemporary indigenous artists, musicians, writers, and activists.
Yeah.
They're building on the legacy of the 1970s.
Okay.
And carrying those traditions forward into the future.
That's inspiring to see how that spirit of resistance and resilience continues to thrive. Gives me hope for the future.
Me too. Me too.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into the 1970s, I think it's important to remember that the struggle for indigenous rights isn't over.
Right.
There are still so many challenges.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ongoing poverty, lack of access to healthcare and education,
right.
the fight for land and resource rights,
and
the continued struggle for justice and recognition.
It can feel overwhelming at times to think about all that still needs to be done.
It does.
But I'm also struck by how much progress has been made, thanks to the courage and determination of those who came before.
The 1970s taught us that change is possible. It requires courage, determination, and a willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult.
Yeah.
But it also requires all of us to educate ourselves, listen to indigenous voices, and be allies in their fight for a better future.
Absolutely.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening for me.
Good. I'm glad.
I feel like I have a much better understanding of the context for the ongoing struggles of indigenous communities.
What stands out to you as the most important takeaway from our conversation today?
For me, it's the power of resilience. Despite centuries of oppression and injustice, indigenous communities never gave up. They fought for their rights. They reclaimed their cultures. And they continue to inspire us with their strength and determination.
They do. They do.
It's been a privilege to share this journey of discovery with you.
Likewise.
I hope this deep dive inspires you to learn more, to listen more, and to take action in whatever ways you can.
Absolutely.
To support indigenous communities in their ongoing struggle for justice and recognition.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the 1970s. A pivotal decade in the fight for indigenous rights.
Yeah.
We hope you'll continue to explore this history and its lasting impact on the world we live in today. It's fascinating to see how the events of the 1970s continue to reverberate today.
Yeah, it's like you said, there's ripples in a pond. They just keep spreading outward and creating these lasting changes.
Exactly.
But we've focused a lot on the political and legal side of things. What about the cultural impact?
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
The 1970s weren't just about legal battles and political victories. It was also a time of incredible cultural resurgence for indigenous communities.
So can you give me an example of that?
Yeah. Think about the impact of events like the Alcatraz Occupation.
Okay, yeah. Remind me what was so significant about that.
It wasn't just a political protest. It was a gathering of indigenous people from all over the country.
Yeah.
Sharing their cultures and traditions, reclaiming their heritage in a very public way.
Right.
It sparked this sense of pride and identity that had been suppressed for generations.
Right, because you're bringing all these people together who have been, you know, kind of separated and marginalized.
Exactly.
And now they're coming together and they're saying, hey, we're still here.
We are.
Our culture is still alive and we're proud of it.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is really powerful.
Absolutely.
So beyond Alcatraz, how did this cultural revival kind of manifest itself?
In so many ways.
Okay.
There was a revival of traditional languages, a resurgence of art and music, and a renewed focus on spiritual practices.
Okay.
All of this helped to strengthen indigenous communities and reconnect them to their roots.
It's so powerful to think about how art and culture can be such powerful tools for healing and empowerment.
Absolutely.
Because it's about more than just, you know, the political side of things.
Yeah.
It's about reclaiming your identity, reclaiming your story.
Right.
So this cultural revitalization wasn't just limited to the U.S., right?
No, at all.
It was happening in Canada as well. So what were some of the ways that it was manifesting itself north of the border?
In Canada, the phasing out of residential schools allowed indigenous communities to begin reclaiming their languages and traditions as well.
Okay.
It was a slow and painful process, but it was so vital to their healing.
So these movements were about so much more than just legal rights. They were about the survival and flourishing of entire cultures.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I think is really important to remember because it's not just about winning a court case. It's not just about, you know, getting a piece of legislation passed. It's about something much deeper.
It is.
It's about the survival of a people. And this cultural revival is still ongoing today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You see it in the work of contemporary indigenous artists, musicians, writers, activists.
It's inspiring to see how that spirit of resistance and resilience continues to thrive. It gives me hope for the future.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the 1970s, I think it's crucial to remember that the struggle for indigenous rights isn't over.
Right. There's still so much work to be done, so many challenges that these communities are facing.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of come to a close here, what are some of the things that our listeners can do to kind of continue this journey?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is to educate yourself.
Okay.
Read books, articles, listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
Seek out indigenous voices and perspectives. Learn about the history, the culture, and the ongoing struggles of indigenous communities.
And don't just rely on you know, mainstream sources.
Exactly.
Go out and find those indigenous voices. Get those perspectives.
Yeah. And once you've started to educate yourself, think about how you can be an ally. Support indigenous-led organizations.
Okay.
Donate to causes that are important to them.
Yeah.
Speak out against injustice and use your voice to amplify theirs.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening for me.
Oh, so well.
I feel like I've learned so much. And I hope that our listeners feel the same way.
You too.
It's been a privilege to share this journey with you.
Likewise.
And we hope that you'll continue to explore this history and its lasting impact on the world we live in today.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.